So last year at AGI, I gave a lecture about reinforcement learning in the brain, and I gave a talk also about large-scale recording in the brain, or from the brain. This time we've got an entire neuro track in AGI, and so I'm going to use my time on the soapbox to try to introduce, explain, and advocate why that might be useful for AGI. Human intelligence is intrinsically something that's meaningful to us, whereas other types of intelligence that may seem a bit more strange or different, well, it can be useful for a lot of tasks, but it's just not the sort of thing that we're viscerally connected with in the same sense that we see typical strong AI show up in sci-fi movies. So a project like OpenCog, for example, just to use as an example, uses many methods, or it's open to a lot of different methods, but overall it really relies on cognitive science to establish what sort of parts it requires of what we think of as a brain or intelligence. And maybe neuroscience can help to elucidate some more of those parts. Now, you might be wondering, what is a typical experiment of cutting edge type of project in neuroscience today? There are lots of interesting projects going on, and just to highlight one that's very popular right now, I'm going to point out the Blue Brain project. In the Blue Brain project, so this is Henry Markram's group in Switzerland, what they do is they try to model at great detail the cortical columns in a rat. And what he's done in his previous work is that he did a lot of studies on the connectivity between neurons, so long-range connectivity, short-range connectivity, and they used that to come up with the statistics that are relevant for these cortical columns. And they also use an electrical model to represent what the neurons do, and the equations called the Hodgkin-Huxley equations to express what these neurons should be doing whenever they're firing, whenever they're active. But the question is, can investigations like this actually help us to advance our understanding of general intelligence? So how does that affect AGI? AI has been guided largely, at least so far, by cognitive science and insights gained from psychophysical experiments. This means that you end up with cognitive architectures and modularity, functional specialization that are expressed in models such as ACT-R and SOAR and many visual system models, reinforcement learning, etc. And Javier made some really good points about this during the LIDA tutorial, actually. He pointed out that cognitive models are complex and sophisticated. And I guess if you're talking about something like artificial general intelligence, you really shouldn't expect something simple and unsophisticated. But anyway, what you're left with is a huge plethora of cognitive models, each one of them derived by focusing on specific tasks. Psychophysical experiments are good at a few things. They're very good at figuring out parameters, limits, error modes, things that help us to determine what sort of functions may actually be going on in the mind and which ones are probably not happening. But they also only illuminate those features that you can test at that moment. So they're only measuring things that are being expressed. So critical aspects of collaboration between implemented functions that may be there could be missed. If you attempt to reverse engineer a CPU, would you restrict yourself to observing a couple of programs, say 5 programs? Would you, for example, do so even if those 5 were picked specifically because they happen to be easy to characterize, because none of those 5 used anything more than, say, 3 of the same operations? This is something that Dharmendra Modha made very clear at one of his recent talks, in fact. He pointed out that most models of the brain only use a very small portion of the knowledge that we have about the brain. And that's without even saying that even those models, even those collections, everything that we know about it is probably incomplete. He also took a deeper look at a presentation that came along on Tuesday at another conference, where he mapped out many more brain regions based on something called the COCOMAC database. That's a database of macaque monkey brain regions and information about them. And he stripped them down by degree until he ended up with what he called the core of the brain, the place where the clustering is particularly dense and where the connections from all the other parts of the brain seem to terminate. Even then, if you simulate that core, it results in data that's really difficult to interpret. And his solution for that, or his temporary solution anyway, was to glue together 16 monitors, which gives him 64 million pixels. That's about 1 pixel per neuron in the cat brain. And whether that's going to help to understand what's going on in there, that's still an open question. But if you don't look inside the box, it's easy to be overconfident about what we actually know about the brain, about the mind, and about intelligence. Without naming names, another good friend of mine recently presented his approach to AGI at a conference, And he began by noting that the local structure in the auditory cortex and the visual cortex and many other areas looked very similar. So the brain seemed to have only one fundamental algorithm. But there's no free lunch, meaning, okay, how can this work on all the problems in life? That can only work if those problems have the basic same underlying structure. Consequently, he assumed it's safe to devise AGI based on one algorithm. Needless to say, he got into a lot of trouble with the neuroscientists in the audience, mostly because there are many parts of the brain that operate quite differently than the neocortex does. But also, what is an algorithm and where do you find it? Is it in the opcodes that are in your computer? Or is it really in the way that you use those to write C functions for a specific purpose? So it's really in the specific circuitry that's formed by the common elements, not by the elements themselves, even if those are, for example, entire mini-columns in the neocortex. This is what makes AGI difficult, no matter what your framework is. Having operators is not the same as having a complex program. I'll call this the Numenta or HTM problem of AGI. We may not know 90% of how the brain works, and I can equally claim that we don't know 90% of the content that makes an AGI. Forming representations is hard, as Josh Hall said. Wouldn't it be interesting, if some of those 90% happen to be the same? So how does one select between available models? How does one validate or test one's assumptions? A good scientific principle is to seek more ground truth, knowables which we can ground our theories and models in. Models are the domain of theorists, and the ground truth and measurements are the domain of experimentalists. One way to get around the problem of inspecting a black box by looking at its input and output is to open it up and investigate what's inside. For a long time, though, neuroscience just didn't have the tools to do that. There was no way to reconcile the very small with the very large. So in that sense, Ben is right when he says that we really don't know much about how the mind is implemented in the brain. But the thing is, we're actually at the cusp of developments that are about to change all of that. And we saw some of it this morning with Ed Boyden's talk. So in this era, where connectome research is accelerating and new projects are appearing on a weekly basis, neuroinformatics is going to begin to learn about mechanisms at the scale and complexity that's relevant to the human brain and to AGI as well. Neuroinformatics is beginning to combine functional models of components with structural information from the connectome. And what you're seeing here is probably one of the best examples of this. Brigman and Winfried Denk recently published this, and it's really an achievement that shows outstandingly that you can derive information about function from high-resolution, large-scale analysis of brain circuitry. What they did here is that they recorded from the ganglion cells in the retina. This is what you can see in the top picture, the upper right little thing with the colorful circles. And they discovered what the receptive field directions were in those ganglion cells. But they also measured and recorded data from a reconstruction, a 3D reconstruction at high resolution of the morphology of the system, so where it was sliced really thin and it was put under an electron microscope. And they were able to use that to derive from the connectivity that they found in this reconstruction what the receptive fields must be. So they found, in fact, that those receptive fields were the same that they'd recorded before. Indeed, from looking at the very detailed structure, they were able to derive function. Similar projects in zebrafish are now underway as well, at both Stanford and Harvard. So the question is it important to be able to deduce functions from that are implemented in brain circuitry? And I would say, if you're wanting to use it to advance AI, then yes. If you want to use it to improve BCI, brain-computer interfaces, then yes. If you want to use it to fix or improve brain function, then yes. If you only want to copy it, then I guess no, except that probably understanding more about it will still help you to identify and correct copy errors. Learning from the brain's implementation is akin to the way a programmer can look at someone else's source code and learn from it. That's why, in a sense, that's a major strength of the open source movement, and that's something you can gain by looking inside the box. The brain's implementation isn't necessarily, this is not even quite on the mark there, isn't necessarily the best one for a specific task, but at least all of the functions are there, and they all work well together. And AGI can learn something about adaptive, robust, self-consistent integration and coordination in a complex system. That's why I'll call this the second big problem, the Novamenta or OpenCog problem. So how, for example, do you self-organize associations at different levels of abstraction, or how do you use the co-design of hardware implementations with their target functions for an efficient autonomous system? Maybe something that could run at 10 watts, for example. There's more, but we don't have much time, so ask about it, and then we'll talk about it later. Oh, now it's not paging forward the way I want to. Obviously, I've done something wrong. Probably have to get out of that box. Yes, there we go. Human intelligence is inextricably linked to the question of AGI. Some of it is about making things that are as versatile as we are. For example, a human can learn how to read, can learn how to do mathematics, and then can go out and read textbooks, read articles, and can become a computational neuroscientist or go work in macroeconomics or something like that. But it could also be that we want to deal with some of the aspects of human intelligence or behavior that we're not satisfied with. For example, we're really not very good at math. We're not good at deductive reasoning. We're not really good at estimating at all, or multitasking. And I guess if we go beyond these fundamentals, it's just that we often struggle with the conflicting demands of our intrinsic drives and of our intellectual pursuits. So whether AGI begins de novo without relationship to human intelligence, or if it's built to resemble human cognition, it's really a tool that we create to do something with a specific goal in mind. Using cool tools is nice, but watching from the sidelines as another intelligence creates future cultures and achieves astonishing things is definitely suboptimal. Our dreams and legends and stories are about heroes who embody superhuman capabilities, who can fly. So right now, I can experience intimately what it's like to carry out vastly parallel neuromorphic computation. That's what's going on inside my head. But I'd also like to be able to experience what it's like to calculate like a calculator. And I'd like to experience thoughts that include quantum computation. I think that if these sorts of things were options, there would be very few of us who would reject the possibility to at least explore that. That's where I think the drive motivating work in AGI is shared with the search to enhance the human experience. That includes fundamental experiences like how we become fixed in our ways as we age, as particular paths are being pruned and other ones are being strengthened, and it's hard to get around that after a while. So it's easy to say that dealing with the brain is hard, that adding memory is easier in a computer, or that access to the details is easier, but stating that something is easier isn't a good reason to reject something that could be hard. After all, there are probably also tons of things that you could do that are a lot easier than making AGI. Artificial general intelligence can also be about enhancing the generality of existing intelligence. Sometimes that involves improving existing AI, maybe something that comes from narrow AI. And so, for example, when it involves improving natural human intelligence, AGI, neural engineering, and brain-machine interfaces become overlapping domains. There's more, but we don't have that much time, so I'm not going to continue on this topic for much longer. You can ask me about it, and we'll talk later. Beyond learning a few things from neuroscience, we can make a case for detailed reverse engineering. There are a bunch of terms in use, but just to keep it concrete, I'll talk about a procedure or conservative approach where you try to copy all the neuroanatomy and the neurophysiology, and that's what we call whole brain emulation. It's conceivable that we can determine the transfer functions, that's what the T there is supposed to represent, of all the important elements, and that we can also, and it's actually increasingly likely that we will, know the structural connectivity between those elements. That's knowledge that you can gain without actually understanding how a mind works. It makes reverse engineering and emulation an approach that could get around stubborn or intractable conceptual hurdles. And in emulation, there's a closer connection with physical ground truths. That can increase the confidence about stepwise developments and its eventual culmination in a working whole. At the moment, developments benefiting whole brain emulation and connectome research are advancing at a rapid clip. Computing hardware is rapidly becoming more parallel, which benefits naturally parallelized processes like the brain. Neuroinformatics is taking steps to address representations at large scale, for example in the blue brain, but also in other attempts such as at the INCF. Recording from the brain is beginning to address large-scale and high-resolution via very large recording arrays, channel insertion, and similar biological approaches. The number of projects addressing problems of whole brain emulation are increasing at an increasing rate. And I just have a few examples up here. In one corner, you see an excerpt from an image taken with the Atlam. Next to that, there's the knife-edge scanning microscope. We've got work to upload basically a C. elegans. There's zebrafish project. There is Ed Boyden down in the other corner, Brainbow, a number of other projects going on. So connectome research is really becoming a major mainstream scientific pursuit. Now to my last topic, what really determines the progress that we make? It's really all about the money, funding for AGI. There's the academic route, of course, seeking grants. In that area, the usefulness of partnership with neuroscience should be obvious, because it's clear that more grants are going to be devoted to human intervention, things where humans feel that they are being helped personally, such as in the NIH, where you try to solve diseases and problems like Alzheimer's and stuff like that. Then there's the private sector, entrepreneurial efforts. Arguably, that's where the true prospects of any new technology lie. It's only when manageable chunks of development, each with their own profit incentives, become apparent that a technology truly takes off. We've already seen the effect of market pull on narrow fields of AI. A concrete example is, for example, at the company I work for, Halcyon, where we have a specific interest in more general AI, namely increasingly sophisticated AI scientists or experimentalists. Broader than most areas of AI, it's still a very well-described task. It's a good case for gradual entrepreneurial improvements. You can incorporate increasingly difficult parts of the task, and at each stage, there are savings for those who implement it, and so there's a market. There's more about this as well, but we only have a couple minutes, so ask about it and we'll talk later. We need entrepreneurial role models. We need people with talent, vision, and a multidisciplinary ability to conceive and guide ventures. As in other fields, success requires both technical skill and artistic ability, communicating across disciplinary boundaries. And I know this is the wrong picture because it should have been an Android since we're here and not something from Apple. So hopefully it's becoming obvious that those neuro researchers and AGI should interact, benefit from each other, and deal with many of the same problems in humans, BCI, and AGI. Open sourcing the brain, learning directly from it, and re-implementing its parts is a potent means to exchange knowledge between neuroscience and AGI. We can use that approach to explore undiscovered functions essential to the mind, the requisite size and complexity of intelligent processing, hardware burdens, the need for massive parallelism as in neuromorphic computing, the need for embodiment or total immersion in realistic problem space. Reverse engineering by connectomics has a need for new tools, and new tools, like telescopes, bring about scientific revolutions. There's a lot more, but we can talk about that later as well. So one way to do AGI is to do de novo intelligence. Another is to enhance existing intelligence to make it more general. And there are gradual ways to do that, and those ways are lucrative. It's not a coincidence that many of the researchers working in AGI are also interested in neuroscience and vice versa. Thank you. Okay, we have a panel at the end, so right now we'll just go straight on to the next talk, since I took quite a while.
Okay, hi. Can everybody hear me? Yeah, more or less. Everybody at the back as well? Good. I have to start with two disclaimers. The first one is that I'm going to be very brief here. And if the arguments seem a little superficial, read the paper, they'll be a little bit more deeper. If you still don't agree, then talk to me and we can talk about it. The second thing is that I'm not an AGI researcher as such. I'm a computational modeler in cognitive science with a heavy interest in neuroscience. And the first time I even heard of AGI was when the call for papers for a neuroscience session came into my inbox. So I thought, hey, California, that sounds good. I'll go to California. And then the second question that came to my mind is, like, why would you even want neuroscience in AGI? Because it wasn't immediately clear to me. And I define intelligence for myself really as a measure of the cognitive abilities of an agent. So I'm offloading the entire problem of defining what intelligence is into the problem of defining how to measure the cognitive abilities of an agent. And the consequence of that is that human-like intelligence isn't necessarily human-like cognition, and what you're after in AGI is human-like intelligence rather than human-like cognition. So I'm guessing really that the interest in neuroscience comes from the fact that it studies the mechanisms that underlie human and animal cognition, and therefore since that is like the only example of an intelligent system that we have, knowing how that works might help us building intelligent systems. Neuroscience inspired. The second thing that came to my mind is, like, haven't we been there, done that? Like, there are people who build models of just computational circuits that they find in the brain without really knowing what they are doing. We had the entire connectionism thing. We have recurrent neural networks, echo state networks, liquid state machines, etc. So I don't want to talk about all of these. I mean, these are all neuroscience inspired approaches, but I think some of these, like all the reservoir computing, they start off with neuroscience, and then very quickly you're into mathematics, physics, dynamical systems, where you can do really amazing things, but you not necessarily have to check back with the brain at any point after that. You can build really clever systems that are that go beyond what the brain does or go into a completely different thing. So I'm more interested in what other type of insights can we gain from neuroscience. And then there is the pessimist in me that says that the understanding of neuroscience is very far from complete. Understanding of human cognition, also very far from complete. So to turn to the mechanisms that you don't understand underlying a system that you don't understand in order to build a similar system with similar properties, good luck. But okay, I'm not that pessimistic, so now let's quickly turn to another thing. It's embodiment, which I think people have heard of now. But if not, okay, it's very difficult to summarize on one slide. Usually people have conferences to talk about embodiment. But the body shapes the mind. That's the fundamental message here. How far is a matter of debate. If we look at the concept of symbol grounding, there are people who believe that the way the mind represents and processes symbols involves the sensory motor level. Intrinsically, it's impossible to process symbols without doing that. Whereas other people will argue that, yeah, okay, maybe you need the sensory motor level to ground the meaning of the symbols, but you can actually process these and do your intelligence stuff at an amodal level, abstractly. What neuroscience evidence we have can be tweaked to support either position, and I don't really want to go into that in too much detail now, but I see three important implications of embodiment, which then have three important consequences. The first one is that the cognitive abilities of a machine, they might well depend on the machine itself. The second one is that if you want human-like cognition, you might need a human-like body. And the third one, which is probably the most important one in this context, is that if you're going to study mechanisms in a human body that are used to give rise to human cognition, it might not necessarily be relevant for machines that have a fundamentally non-human embodiment. Okay, there are consequences. The first consequence is that if you want to design an intelligent machine, you probably have to design both the machine and the algorithms and not just the latter. And the field of cognitive robotics, for instance, is getting into that a lot. The picture you see here is an iCup, because everybody's talking about the now. I thought I'll put up a different picture. And you don't necessarily have to have a human embodiment, but the capabilities of your intelligent agent are going to depend on what its particular shape inside the world is going to be. Second consequence, it's possible, really possible, that you cannot do human cognition if you do not have a human body. There are many studies that show how the human body affects the human mind at all levels. I'm citing the snag effect there. It's probably not the best example, but what it basically says is that the way you represent numbers depends on your body. If I ask you to turn your head left and right, and to randomly produce numbers, you're going to produce smaller numbers on average if your head is turned to the left than if your head is turned to the right. You have this spatial representation of small numbers to the left, large numbers to the right. Okay, the more important consequence, again, is that, well, maybe there is no point in doing neuroscience-inspired AGI. I don't really think that, but if you really want to be extreme about the consequences of embodiment, maybe you want to get to that point. But I think it's more useful to see it as that when you look at neuroscience, you can't just blindly copy what you see. You have to ask yourself some questions. More importantly, what is it that I'm actually seeing, and how does it relate to the embodiment that I'm also observing? So some of the mechanisms that you might be seeing can just be a constraint of the body. Just because of the fact that you're in a human body means, in a biological chemical system, means that you have to do things in a certain way that are not a constraint. They're not really giving you any advantage. It's just that you don't have any other options. Then there might be mechanisms that actually exploit the embodiment. So they take your body and then they do something funky with it. I think these are the most interesting ones for AGI. We'll get to that in a second. And the third one is that there might be mechanisms which are completely independent of the embodiment. I have some examples where the body constraints. Well, I picked spikes for that. No, it's probably not everybody is going to agree with that, but I like the example because what we have is very small animals like C. elegans was also mentioned in the previous talk. They don't use spikes. They have electrotonic potential, so slow graded signaling things. And They're faster, they carry more information, they're really better than spike signaling in almost every way, except they're really bad at long-distance signaling. So it's fine if you're a little animal that's a millimeter long with all the neurons in like a tenth of a millimeter, but if you have a human brain, can't do that. So the distance required for signaling in the brain might well be the constraint that made us use spikes rather than other things. Body-independent examples, I can't really think of one. I think a lot of people would say that generally the computational mechanisms that the brain implements might be one. Whether that is really body-independent or still constrained by the body, or that I don't know. I don't want to get into that discussion. The body facilitates, I see mainly language and the mirror neuron system. Language because the body helps you ground the concepts that you have, if nothing else. And mirror neuron system because I recently wrote a paper and I kind of want to plug it a bit now. What I want to say about mirror neurons is that they are neurons that fire both when you observe actions and when you execute the same action. And one study in particular by Fogassi, they did electrophysiological recordings in the monkey brain in the intraparietal lobe, I think. And what they showed you is that their mirror neurons are organized into pool of neurons that each encode a specific motion primitive. So some neurons will be encoding a reach, other neurons will be encoding a grasp, and a third pool of neurons will be encoding bringing whatever you grasp now to the mouth. If it's food, then to eat. And what they also showed is that some neurons fire only if the motion primitive is observed in a specific context of a specific goal, so only if you're going to eat the object, or rather than placing the object somewhere, and other neurons fire independently of that. And I really have no time to go into that in a lot of details, but there is a paper currently under review where I try to show that how many neurons will fire only when you see a specific goal, and how many neurons will be firing independently of the goal, just generally, is the consequence of the input into the mirror neurons system. Depending on how the body provides these inputs, and depending on how you then encode it, you can have any sort of organization that you want within the mirror system. I'm using that to say a little bit that the mirror system actually exploits the body in that sense. The body provides information in a certain way, and the mirror neuron system can use that that way the information is provided in order to create an organization that can then be used in higher level cognitive systems, tasks, whatever. Take-home message then really is that if you're going to do a neuroscience approach to the design of an intelligent system, you should not forget that the data you're getting from taking is the data from a human body, from a system that has developed over years to create human cognition in a human body. And yeah, you can do a lot of interesting things with it, I think. But when you're building a machine, you have to be aware that it's not exactly the same thing. So when you take examples of where the body actually facilitates what you can do with your neuroscience, you probably can't translate that one-to-one to a machine, but what you can probably do is come up with a similar system so that your intelligent machine in a different embodiment can still make the maximal use of its embodiment. That's it, yeah. Next. Thank you.
Okay, well, for about 30 years, I was involved in the design of extremely complex real-time electronic control systems. And for the last 25 years, partly overlapping with the other 30, I've investigated how to apply the techniques we use to maintain understanding of very complex electronic systems to understanding how higher cognition works in terms of physiology. And one spin-off is a conclusion that the architecture of the brain has some important lessons for artificial general intelligence. If you're going to design any complex electronic system, two architectures are of great importance. One is the functional architecture that divides up the features of the system into groups of closely related features and specifies how those features are going to interact. The second is the physical architecture, and this divides up the physical resources of the system into components that perform different information processes. In this case, electronic systems, data read and write, and execution of instructions. And any feature uses most or all of the components in the physical architecture. And almost all electronic systems have the familiar memory processor architecture. And it's interesting that this physical architecture is so ubiquitous. Now, this is the physical resource architecture of the brain. And it's interesting that structures corresponding with the cortex, hippocampus, thalamus, basal ganglia, cerebellum, etc., are ubiquitous in the mammal brain and also can be found in bird brains, and to a degree even in reptile brains. So the relevant question is, what are the information processes are being performed by these different structures? And this is a view of those information processes, and they're not the same as the processes going on in a computer. On the left, there's a group of structures, including the cortex, that define and detect conditions within the information available to the brain, which means sensory inputs, but also information about the state of the brain itself, including the cortex. Receptive fields can be defined as groups of related conditions, and the receptive field is detected if a significant proportion of the conditions are present. And receptive field detections are communicated to the structure on the right. And in the basal ganglia, each detection is interpreted as a set of recommendations in favor of many different behaviors, each with an individual weight. And the basal ganglia determines the total recommendation weights of all the behaviors and implements the strongest. Consequence feedback, or rewards, changes the weights of recently accepted behaviors. And weight changes are behaviors. They need special management because they have very potent effects on system behavior, as you can see from human addiction. Now, as I said, any one receptive field detection in the cortex has many different behavioral meanings. But receptive fields have to be learned, and any changes risk damaging the integrity of all the previously acquired meanings. So there's a special subsystem, the hippocampus, that manages the changes. It detects special receptive fields that recommend when and where other cortical receptive fields will change. And then a few words about the cerebellum. I'll skip over the others for the moment. Sometimes a sequence of actions is frequently used. Playing the piano or speaking, there are different sequences of muscle movements that are frequently used in the same order. It would be possible to go through receptive field detection and recommendation weight comparison at each point in the sequence for each action, but it will be slow. So it's more efficient to store frequent sequences in the cerebellum, and an initial receptive field detection triggers a sequence that usually goes through to a conclusion. So the cortex is a thin sheet of neurons with a pronounced column structure perpendicular to the sheet. There are several million columns, and each column detects a different receptive field. And a representation of some receptive fields detected in cortical area TE is shown on the right. This area is important for distinguishing between different categories of visual objects. But note, the receptive fields don't correspond with object categories. One receptive field recommends identifying a number of different categories, and the basal ganglia implements a behavior appropriate for the strongest recommended category, like saying the name of the category. The cortex is divided up into probably several hundred areas, and some are numbered in the diagram. Each area has a different detailed column structure, different sources of inputs, and different output targets. So each area detects a different kind of receptive field. Each kind of receptive field is useful for recommending a number of different types of behavior. For example, the diagram shows the cortical areas that are active during two tasks: remembering a past event and imagining a future event. And each task has two phases. One is conceiving an event from some verbal cues, and the second is elaborating the details. Now, you might think that remembering and imagining are different kinds of tasks, but they use a lot of the same resources. Exactly the same green areas are used for conceiving an event, exactly the same red areas for elaborating an event. The difference is that there are some extra blue areas that support conceiving a future event. And so a major design decision, if you like, inverted commas, is specifying the number of areas and the types of receptive field that would be most useful for the kind of behaviors the brain has to carry out. And at a more detailed level, neurons do the condition detection. Branches of the dendritic tree define different conditions, and there's a complex integration process by calcium action potentials illustrated in the top right to determine if enough conditions are present to trigger a neuron receptive field detection. Column receptive fields sometimes have to change, and there are two principles to minimize the risks to the existing behavioral meanings. Don't change unless it's absolutely necessary, and change as little as possible. And in any situation, there needs to be at least a minimum number of recommendations to make sure there's a high integrity selection. So if less than a minimum number of receptive field detections are going on, some receptive fields have to be expanded slightly, so they're going to be detected as well. Now, to get the minimum change, think about the column structure for a moment. The top layer neurons detect relatively simple conditions, the middle layer more complex, the bottom layer even more complex, and these are the outputs, the column receptive field detections. If there's lots of middle layer activity and no bottom layer, that indicates that only a slight expansion would actually get detection. So if expansions are needed, you need to find the columns with the strongest internal activity. And that's what the hippocampal system does. The middle layer activity of columns all across the cortex is collected. It's organized into groups of columns that have often expanded their receptive fields at the same time in the past, and then into groups of groups. And finally, these supergroups are communicated to the hippocampus proper. And then in the hippocampus proper, there's a competition process that determines which are the most appropriate columns for expansion, and there's outputs from CA1 that drive the receptive field expansions. Now, I've talked about the information processes, but how can these processes be used to support complex intelligence? Now, intelligence can access information from past experiences, not just the current sensory inputs, which means some indirect activation of receptive fields. But how do you pick which fields to activate? In the diagram, just one cortical area is illustrated a number of times. At the top, all the columns that are ever activated in response to seeing different birds are colored red. Any actual bird experience in the next four illustrations will activate a different subset of columns, although the predominant recommendation strength will be in favor of saying maybe that's a bird. An unfamiliar object, like at the bottom, will activate less than the minimum number of columns, so there's got to be some receptive field expansion, illustrated by the shading. Now, different birds activate different sets of columns. But some columns turn up relatively often, but not always, in response to different birds. I've indicated in some shading. Now, suppose each time you see a bird, you hear the word bird. There's some auditory columns that are going to be activated as well. And some of those auditory columns will often be active at the same time as the frequent visual columns. Now, if the auditory columns can recommend indirect activation of the visual columns on the basis of frequent simultaneous past activity, then hearing the word will activate a set of columns as if you're looking at a kind of average bird. In other words, a semantic memory. Now, think about recalling an event. At the time of an event, let's suppose columns in different areas, all sorts of areas, will be activated. If the event is novel, there'll be quite a bit of receptive field expansion. Now, suppose a bit later, you have some verbal cue words. And those cue words will result in activation of some visual columns indirectly, as discussed earlier. But now let's suppose that columns also have recommendation strengths to activate other columns on the basis of simultaneous past receptive field expansion. What's going to happen if you put that kind of recommendation into operation is that it's going to lead to an active column, indirectly activated population that will approximate to the column population that was active during the original experience. In other words, you'll have an episodic memory of that earlier experience. Now, I want to touch briefly on some of the other structures on the right, and let me comment briefly, as I say, on the basal ganglia. Behavior selection has to meet two general constraints. Usually select a behavior and never select two incompatible behaviors. And the arrangement of nuclei in the basal ganglia meet the constraints. The striatum determines the total strengths for each behavior. A direct path encourages behavior. An indirect path discourages other behaviors. And a modulation path makes sure that no more than one behavior is selected at any particular time. And then behaviors are implemented via the thalamus by triggering the release of cortical information to the appropriate place. Now, reward behaviors are selected by the basal ganglia as well, but they have to be implemented back into the basal ganglia because their weight changes. So there's got to be very careful management of strategic, tactical, general movement, and detailed movement behaviors. And in humans, reward behaviors can go badly wrong in the case of addictions. Now, I think I'll skip over the thalamus for the sake of time. Basically, the thalamus is picking the information that will be passed from one cortical area to another on the basis of cortical recommendations. And I'll say a little bit then about the cerebellum, which is, if I can find my Thanks, yeah. So basically, the cerebellum has two parallel paths. The regular path through the basal ganglia and thalamus is the one that selects behavior, and then the cerebellar cortex and cerebellar nuclei get all sorts of cortical information, and they can drive sequences of behaviors. And again, for details, see the paper. So there are some theoretical arguments that as a system needs to learn more and more features with limited physical resources, it'll tend to be constrained into the brain architecture I've been describing. And the comment, be careful with functional architectures that don't pay attention to the underlying information processes. Almost any functional architecture could work, but as the ratio of the features that have to be learned to the available resources increases, systems that don't use this kind of architecture will run into some problems. And the problems basically are either new learning will tend to destroy old learning, or the resource requirements will tend to be excessive. And this architecture in the brain has a demonstrated capability to be scaled up to handle very large numbers of learned features. Thank you.
Okay, good afternoon, everybody. My name is Chris Kello. Janelle Zeri and Brian Cursor are students who've been working with me on the project that I'm about to tell you about. So the title of our talk is What Makes a Brain Smart? So let's first start with questions about what the roles of neuroscience might be in research on artificial general intelligence. So one of the roles that we can think about are cognitive architectures, and I think we've heard a lot about that over the past couple of days. So you can imagine basically taking large-scale wiring diagrams in our models and trying to map them onto large-scale systems-level brain descriptions, right? Certainly this is something that's been going on for a long time and needs to continue to go on. I would just like to sort of caution that one of the issues here is that we are largely driven by the architectures and mapping them onto the brain structures rather than the other way around. So it's not clear to me, at least at this point in the sort of state of research, that we're drawing a lot from neuroscience at this level. I think more it's going in the other direction, but we can talk about that more during the panel. A second level that we can talk about the role of neuroscience in AGI is that we can sort of bring it down to sort of microcircuitry level. So we can talk about laminar structure, columnar structure, we can talk about neuronal structure, right? And certainly there's an enormous amount of research going on at this level as well. That, again, certainly is going to be very valuable, I think, as we move forward with AGI research. One cautionary note here that we've already heard, I think Ed Boyden mention, is that we're at such a level of detail here that it's going to be potentially difficult to determine what are the principles that matter for AGI when we get down to this level, and what are the principles that are more sort of implementational, that have more to do with the biology rather than the sort of intelligence part of this level of analysis. So the one that I'm going to talk a little bit about today is this sort of third level that we can imagine, which is sort of a neuronal principle kind of level. And again, I think we heard something about this from Ed Boyden today. This is the idea that we're going to try to draw abstractions from, general abstractions from neuroscience at whatever we might take our best guess as the basic sort of unit and see what we can do with those abstractions, right? And as Ed told us today, the neuron seems like the sort of a good place to start. And in particular, when we're dealing with sufficiently complex nervous systems, we've got the spike, okay? We've got also at a very general level, all of these nervous systems have recurrent activity at various scales, right? We've got recurrent activity locally, we've got it sort of mid-range, we've got long-range recurrent activity. So that seems to be a fundamental principle. And then we've got plasticity, right? We've got synaptic plasticity of various kinds. So what you see here is basically STDP, spike timing dependent plasticity. It's something that's very popular and gaining a lot of attention these days. We've got Hebbian plasticity, all sorts of mechanisms. But if we put these three together, this seems like a good place to sort of try to draw principles, right? Draw information from neuroscience, and that might tell us something about intelligence. So if you basically just take those principles I just mentioned, it seems somewhat trivial, right? It's kind of, what's the big deal? We all sort of knew that. Reservoir computing, as somebody just mentioned, liquid state machines, echo state networks, I think has taught us a pretty interesting lesson about just these very, very simple principles. And I'm going to sort of play this out over the next 5-6 minutes. So the principles, the lessons that I think we can draw from those principles are that if you just look at recurrent spike dynamics, okay, we know they're, so they're all fundamental to cortical circuits. But what's interesting is that it appears that memory and computation are very generic and very inherent to pretty much any kind of recurrent spike dynamics, provided that you have the sort of right level of recurrence, and I'll get into that. So the bottom line, the take-home message here is that maybe general intelligence, maybe AGI we can learn a lesson from this, right? That basically recurrent spike dynamics have inherent to them, almost whether you like it or not, memory and computation. So maybe, maybe we should base some of our theories on that. So in case you're not familiar with reservoir computing, here's a basic diagram from Bertschinger and Notschlager. The idea is that you have a recurrent network that has ongoing activity. Inputs come into that network, and they perturb that activity. They change the nature of that activity, right? Now, the importance is sort of the key break, I would say, from previous work to sort of this style of modeling is that recurrent activity is not learned. It's generic, okay? It's general purpose. It just has general memory and computational capacity to it, and I'll get more into that in a minute. And the idea of a liquid state machine or a reservoir computing device is that you're going to learn a very simple function, like a linear classification, for example, to read off of that recurrent activity. So the recurrence is hard, right? It's nonlinear, it's very difficult to control, but the idea is don't bother. Just let it be what it is, and then learn an easier function to read off of that nonlinear dynamic, okay? So the title of the talk, what makes a brain smart? If you come at that question from this approach of these neuronal principles and reservoir computing, well, now we can reframe the question, right? And maybe make some traction here. We can say, what makes a good reservoir, right? Now, I'm not saying that all parts of the brain are all working like a liquid state machine. That's sort of silly. It's a principle, right? It's a principle that there's something important to this idea of memory and computation being inherent to recurrent dynamics. If it's true, then we got to know what makes good dynamics in this regard. Now, what I want to sort of basically try to drive home today is that a dynamic balancing of excitation and inhibition is going to turn out to seem to be an important answer to that question. Not the only answer, right? But an important answer to the question. And again, I'm going to go back to Ed Boynton's talk. So he showed you homeostasis, right? And how the brain basically, if you knock out certain parts, knock out some excitatory parts, the inhibitory parts come in and try to sort of level the playing field, so to speak. So this is exactly the kind of thing that I'm talking about here. So now what I want to tell you is just give you a sense of some of the work that we're doing along these lines and the kind of mechanism that we're using in these models to get this dynamic balancing of excitation and inhibition. Okay, so we're going to use a principle called critical branching. It's a kind of homeostasis, a rather special kind of homeostasis that I won't have too much time to go into here. But the basic idea is if you think about spiking in a recurrent network as a branching process, where each spike branches into some number of future spikes over time, then you can describe something called a branching ratio, which says, given a certain number of spikes at time t, how many spikes do you have going forward at time t plus tau, or something like that. In that framework, in that formalism, there's a very simple idea here, which is that you generally need your network to have a critical branching ratio somewhere near 1. Why is that? It's fairly straightforward. If it's less than 1, spikes die out. Over time, you're guaranteed, right, this is on average, right? Locally, it can be more or less than 1. On average, if it's less than 1, you're guaranteed that your network is going to die out over time. It may take a long time to do that, but it will die out. If your branching ratio is greater than 1, you're guaranteed that your network will blow up over time. Again, on average, expected, etc. Right? So if you think about this, then there's just a simple idea that almost like has to be true. It has to be the case that networks framed this way have to be somewhere near a branching ratio of 1, which is called critical branching. So I don't have time to go into the details, of course. You can look at the papers a little bit more. There's more papers on the website, blah, blah, blah. But what we've done is come up with a really simple way to get networks to very generically, somebody mentioned, you get very quickly into complicated math. This is not complicated math, okay? This is sort of biologically, I would say, plausible kind of mechanism that will take a network of any kind of structure and get it to be somewhere near critical branching. The basic idea, okay, without going into the details of what you're seeing on there, the basic idea is something like this. the synaptic connectivity you see in the brain, according to this theory, defines the space of possible networks that the system, the tissue, the network, the brain can play within, okay? And what the model does is say, I'm going to take those synapses and I'm going to enable them or disable them in a dynamic, simple, sort of rule-based way, such that I will explore that space of connectivity within the large potential space, and I'll create basically an effective connectivity that only includes the enabled synapses, and those will go to critical branching. Okay, again, I'm skipping a lot, but that's the basic idea. Okay. Why, you know, there's many ways to do this. If you're any neuroscientists in the audience, you know about synaptic scaling and homeostatic regulation, all sorts of mechanisms. This is kind of a new one, at least in the neuroscience community, not new in the physics community. Why would we go with this, right? Why am I telling you about this one? Again, don't have time to tell you about it today, but what, you know, the story's a little backwards here, but what really got us into this way of thinking about spiking networks is that we see these power laws, these scaling laws, okay, and here's 3 examples, again, don't have time to go into it. We see these scaling laws all over the brain and all over behavior. I'm actually a behavioral scientist. I started with behavior and worked my way down to the spikes here to sort of figure out the results that we were seeing in intelligent behaviors showing these kinds of variations that didn't make any sense to us. It turns out that critical branching allows you to understand these behaviors, understand these phenomena, understand these power laws. Okay. Now, more to the point of AGI is that what we and this is basically really just kind of based off the Bertschlager-Notschlager paper that I mentioned earlier when I sort of introduced reservoir computing. When you have a network that is critical branching, when it sort of has this kind of balance, it also maximizes its memory and computational capacity when you sort of analyze it as a reservoir computing device. So again, no time, but the basic idea is, remember when I said how you sort of send inputs to the network and they perturb the dynamic? And you can test whether that dynamic has a memory by, let's say, for example, you send bit-like patterns into the network, and then you try to perform a nonlinear function on those temporal bit patterns. So, for example, XOR. And you can perform an XOR function over time, such that n bits back, or n and n minus 1, perform the XOR function given the current pattern, and that will tell you something about the memory of the dynamic. What this graph is showing is that way of thinking about memory and computation is maximized, at least in this case, when you're critical branching and falls off to sub and supercritical. Okay, just to show you, if I have enough time, let's see, that this can actually, I'm not going to spend too much time on this. Let's see if it's working. Just to show you that this actually kind of does something semi-interesting. What we did was we took one of these networks, we hooked it up to a webcam, and we basically then used a second kind of very simple Hebbian algorithm that would learn to basically classify, based on these spike patterns that you see, classify objects that we put in front of it. Okay, and in this case, we have a lock and keys, and I'm not sure if we're going to get to it, but what's going to happen here over time is that, sort of right before your eyes, this is sort of in real time, what you see is that based on those spiking input patterns, on the right, you saw spikes start to sort of come online. That was basically the algorithm sort of finding a network in that space that would more or less be critical branching. And then what you see with the red and the blue there is this sort of second step of the process and says, okay, once you've got yourself to a good reservoir, to a good dynamic, now let's see if you can start to tell the difference between a lock and a key. And it's a very sort of open-ended, somewhat contrived kind of situation. And you can kind of see those red and the blue bars on my right, I guess, is that basically it does pretty quickly starts to learn the difference between locks and keys in general without having to worry about translation variance and all those kinds of things. And I think at one point, Brian did this work, I think at one point he switches the lock and switches the keys, and it kind of generalizes without a problem. Again, it's a toy problem, okay? This is all it knows is locks and keys. But it just shows, it's sort of an existence proof that you can do something interesting with this kind of model. Okay, let's see if I can get myself out of that. Oh, okay. So, conclusions. So, neuronal principles, I think, are useful. a useful level. I mean, all these levels are probably useful to try to connect neuroscience with AGI, but I would like to argue that this is a particularly useful level. Critical branching is an adaptive principle that leads to self-tuning, spiking neural networks, and as a general purpose computing reservoir, it may be useful for AGI. Thanks.
Okay, I'm not going to attempt to defend a claim quite as general as the one on the title, I'm afraid, because I've only got 10 minutes. And instead, I'm going to argue for this particular claim, which is that general intelligence and consciousness share a common foundation, at least in the biological case. And at the end, I'll try and hint at how I can beef that up into the much larger claim that's in the title. And the essence of the argument is that modular small world networks with a certain structure support. They provide a common foundation for, first of all, for providing a large repertoire of metastable coalitions in the brain, which in turn provide support for flexible cognition, and at the same time, the same kinds of network structures provide support for a global neuronal workspace, which, according to certain theories, according to global workspace theory, is the foundation for consciousness. So I'll start off by giving a quick introduction to global workspace theory. So global workspace theory is one of the leading contenders for a scientific theory of consciousness, and it's based on a particular type of architecture. And the particular type of architecture involves having a large collection of parallel specialist processes and a global workspace. And the idea is that this collection of parallel specialist processes cooperate and compete for access to the global workspace, and then the coalition of processes that wins this competition then gets to broadcast out or influence the whole cohort of parallel processes. And then this sort of alternation between competition and broadcast then carries on in that kind of way. And then within the context of that kind of architecture, then global workspace theory makes a couple of empirical claims. And that's the really important bit. But the essence of the architecture really is that it harnesses the power of massively parallel computation. And the global workspace itself exhibits a serial procession of states, but each state-to-state transition is the result of massively many individual computations. But the specific claims of global workspace theory are threefold, really. First of all, that the human brain, in some sense, instantiates this kind of global workspace architecture. And then these two important claims, that information processing that is localized and occurs just within the parallel specialists is non-conscious, and only information that is broadcast is consciously processed. So that's the essence of global workspace theory. And there's a good deal of empirical evidence has accrued over the years for this theory, which dates back to 1988 when Bernard Baars first published his book. But now there's growing empirical theory, and of course I can present lots of slides about the empirical evidence for the theory. But of course there isn't time to do that. So, but we can talk about it a little later. But the critical thing I do want to talk about is what is this. So the vital part of this is to show how the human brain might instantiate this kind of architecture. So the question there is what really could potentially correspond to a global neuronal workspace. And according to the ideas that are being pursued by quite a number of people, including, for example, Stanislas Dehaene and his colleagues and myself, the global neuronal workspace is essentially a communications infrastructure that's located in the white matter. And the white matter, the neural white matter, is the collection of long-range fibers that joins together the different regions of the grey matter. And we can study, it's a very hot topic in neuroscience to study the connectivity of the brain through studying the white matter. And here we see a diffusion tensor, results of some diffusion tensor imaging on the white matter, and you can see how it's possible using DTI to extract out all of these white matter tracts. And having extracted those kinds of tracts using DTI techniques, you can then you can turn this kind of data, you can turn it into this kind of data, which is essentially a network comprising nodes and edges, and you can then apply the mathematics of graph theory to understand the resulting network. And it turns out that when you look at, for example, the human brain, that certain particular network motifs or network characteristics appear. So what we find is that the network that you get has small world properties, it's modular, and it has hub nodes and a particular connective core of hub nodes, which you see in the middle. And this was alluded to, I think, also in Randal's talk right at the beginning. This kind of work that's also been done with the macaque. So this is what you see. This kind of set of features. So it's a modular, hierarchically modular, small world network with a collection of hub nodes, of connector hubs that are the nodes that join together the different modules, and you have a core of these hub nodes which joins everything together. So this is a more abstract representation of the same thing. So this is what we have: a modular small world network with these connector hubs. And you can isolate from this. You can isolate this this connective core, which you see on the right here. And according to the kind of theory which I advocate, you can identify this connective core with the global neuronal workspace, or at least this connective core of the human brain is a very good candidate for the locus of a global neuronal workspace. Okay, so here's a couple of important sort of messages from that. So the idea is that information and influence funnel into and fan out from this connective core, and the connective core acts as a limited bandwidth processing bottleneck, which allows for serial mental operation. So you get this serial from parallel. But more importantly, for the context of the present talk, it also promotes cognitive integration, so that the animal can marshal a coherent response to the ongoing situation from the totality of the resources of its brain, thanks to this combination of broadcast out of information and funneling of information into this connective core. Okay, so remember that I'm trying to defend these two sort of forks of this claim. So I've given you a very, very quick argument that this kind of network supports consciousness. Of course, this is a massive claim, and how can I possibly in 5 minutes? 5 minutes for that one. But okay, there's a whole, an awful lot of other material on this. Okay, now the second thing I want to talk about now is flexible cognition. So that was the lower part of this sort of the lower tine of this fork that I want to defend. Okay, so for a cognitively well-endowed animal, it confronts a space of affordances in its environment that's combinatorially structured and open-ended, and the animal can explore. A cognitively well-endowed animal can explore this space of affordances either online or offline. By offline, I mean through imagination, if you like, or through mental rehearsal. But the critical thing is that in order to open up new vistas of affordance in this open-ended space, then the animal requires a degree of cognitive integration, which will enable it to combine previously related regions of expertise. So essentially, the essential insight there is that you want arbitrary combinations of brain processes to be able to come together to deal with what's potentially a new situation. So it might be that you need to form some completely novel collection of sensory and motor and memory processes taken from different areas of expertise if you want to deal with a situation that you've never seen before. So the real question is, how is that achievable within the brain? How does the brain do that? So yes, so if the constitution of a process coalition, a coalition of brain processes, if you always just get tried and tested coalitions, then the animal is only going to be capable of stereotypical responses. And if it sticks to stereotypical responses, then it's going to be blind to portions of that affordance space. So it's not going to be cognitively well endowed. It's not going to be able to explore this open-ended, combinatorially structured space of affordances. So the real question is, how is combinatorial, open-ended coalition formation achieved in the biological brain? And my argument is, of course, that the same kind of foundation, the same kind of connective foundation, is what underlies that. So let me just check my timing. Oh no, right, I've run out of time according to this. How long have we actually got? Right, two or three more minutes. Okay, so according to Pascal Fries and his communication through coherence hypothesis, then what glues together different brain processes that might be distributed around the brain is synchronous oscillation. So a collection of brain processes or a collection of populations of neurons that are oscillating in synchrony, even though they're distributed around the brain, are able to communicate and interact with each other. Now, the kind of computer models that I've been working with have shown that modular small world networks, the same kind of networks that we see in the brain, can support a large repertoire of metastable coalitions of interacting synchronous populations of oscillators. So it's essentially showing this kind of property. And this little graph that you see here actually shows 8 populations of oscillators, and it shows how they come in and out of synchrony with each other. And you can see that there's a large repertoire of coalitions. So when the high numbers mean large synchrony, so when you get several lines at the top, then that means you've got those populations of oscillators are all working as a coalition, basically. So you've got lots of different coalitions of coming and going in this metastable way. And it's been recently shown by Cabral and Deco and others that resting state fMRI data exhibits exactly these dynamical properties. And it's also the case that the default mode network, which is, of course, one of the most prominent network that you see in resting state fMRI data, coincides with the connective core of the human brain that I pointed out earlier on. So all of this is very suggestive. Okay, so that's been a quick whirlwind tour of those two sort of tines of the fork, that the same kind of connective infrastructure supports a global neuronal workspace, which according to global workspace theory is what you need to be able to draw a conscious, unconscious distinction in the processing in the human brain, and also supports the formation of open-ended arbitrary coalitions of brain processes, which is what you need for flexible cognition. So that's the original claim. And just sort of 10 seconds on how would we bolster this? Well, to the stronger claim that's in the title, well, that's obviously that requires at least another 10 minutes. So that is a matter of making some of these arrows point the other way. But I guess that in a nutshell, I believe that the very same constraints apply even when you vary the substrate. Although, of course, varying the substrate means that your connective infrastructure that you're talking about there is going to be between massively parallel processes of a different sort. They're not going to be necessarily spiking neurons. They could be other things. But I think the same basic constraints apply. So it really was a whirlwind tour. If you want to read more about it, I've summarized what's in chapters 4 and 5 of my current book. So, thank you.
And of course, we'll use the same approach where those asking questions, they come up to the front here, and we can use some of these microphones here, or at least one of them.
My question was for Murray. I was just wondering, is there any evidence that the small world with the hub pattern, you have small worlds connected by a hub, is there any evidence that that is recursive, so that in what you presented, the small world might itself have a collection of small worlds that have its own individual hub? local hub, I guess.
Yeah, sure. In fact, the concept of a hub node can be subdivided into so-called provincial hubs and connector hubs. And so I was concentrating on the connector hubs, but you can look at modules and subdivide them hierarchically. Again, you find that within the human brain connectome, for example, the high-level modules get subdivided into lower, smaller modules, which have their own connector hubs between them, which, if you're looking at the top level, you think of as provincial hubs. So it does have that kind of recursive structure. Yeah.
Well, this is a comment which arose from the presentation on embodiment, for which thank you. But it's to anybody interested to respond. It seems to me there's an aspect of embodiment that tends to go unremarked, unnoticed, which is shared between many organisms with very different bodies: elephants, gorillas, birds, humans, chickens. Namely, we're embedded in a 3D space with time, and there are other things in the same environment, some of them inert, like fences and doors and nuts and branches and leaves, and others active, like predators, prey, and whatever. And I suspect that there's a huge amount that biological evolution had to do to enable all of those species to cope with the problems of being in such an environment, and that it may well be that there are common solutions. So if an elephant has to push down a tree, obviously it's got a trunk instead of hands and legs, but nevertheless, in order to push a tree down, it's got to bring two surfaces into contact with force applied in the direction roughly perpendicular to the tangents at which they meet, and so on. And things of that sort, if you want to grasp something and you've got either jaws or fingers or two hands or whatever, then again, you've got to bring two surfaces together, but with the thing you want to grasp between them. And it seems that there's an awful lot of that kind of stuff that does not depend in the details of the morphology of the individual, but it can do in very specific cases. But if you can abstract away from that, you can do a lot more. You can understand what somebody else is doing. You can see what your kids are about to do that may not work, and then you then want to help them. You can see what a predator might be wanting to do to your kids, etc. So I suspect that there's a vast amount of competence in humans and other animals that doesn't depend on the specific details of the body morphology, although there's another whole lot of stuff that does for real-time interaction, running, jumping, and so on.
Anybody want to take a question? Otherwise, I might have a comment or so. Okay, well, I think you're probably right in a sense. There's another aspect to this, by the way, and instead of just focusing on, okay, why do these animals all seem to have the same types of brain regions, and does this have something to do with doing the same tasks? There's also this aspect of actually regarding the environment around you as a computational resource. So this is something I tried to bring up at a previous talk, which is that we don't have to do all the work in our heads. If we're trying to chase a prey, we don't have to compute its entire trajectory and figure out where we can catch it, because we constantly update what we're doing. We have recurrent activity going on there. We've got a feedback from the environment to us. So the entire universe is helping us compute all sorts of stuff. And that's true. We're all living in the same universe. So if you've got an AGI that you're training in an entirely different universe, let's say it's only dealing with stock market data, or it's only dealing with a virtual world, then you have a different kind of feedback, and so you're going to perhaps end up with different kinds of computational structures. So you may indeed have to look at those kinds of embodiment questions, I guess.
An example of what you're talking about is the fact that all of these organisms need to get information about what's in the environment, even though they're going to do slightly different things about it. And they'll learn things like if there's something you can't see, if you move in a certain way, you see more of it. And if you move in the other way, you see less of it, and so on. That would be another kind of thing which advances. The information processing is shared between the organism and the environment.
Okay, yeah.
I think there are many of those.
So you,
a question for Murray. The global workspace, what if any, is their relationship to short-term memory? And if so, the limitation or human limitation of 5 to 7 concepts that we can handle?
Yeah, I think actually the global workspace is certainly not the same thing as working memory. They're somewhat different concepts. So I don't think there necessarily has to be, you know, a relationship there. I mean, here's an example of something that distinguishes the two things, that we can hold things in working memory without actually being conscious of them, or being in working memory all the time. So I might, for example, I have some idea of who's sitting to my left here, which is obviously held in working memory because it's a very short-term thing. It's Andrew sitting on my left, and I don't have to look back there, but I haven't been consciously, you know, rehearsing that fact all of the time. So I see them as different things, although it may be that that you require. There's good evidence that consciousness is required to access working memory. So I probably had to be consciously aware of Andrew at one point to know that he was sitting on my left for that information to go into working memory. So there's a relationship, but I think they're different things. And actually, I have noticed that in the literature, you do quite often find people who confuse or conflate those concepts rather too much, perhaps because of that phrase workspace and working memory are too similar. But to my mind and to Bernie Barr's minds, they're related but different.
Of course, while you're correct that working memory and consciousness aren't the same thing, that doesn't necessarily mean that, for example, some of the theories that you just presented about what's behind the basically global workspace, that they are necessarily correct. So it could be that, let's say, that there is an oscillatory model for working memory, which requires these oscillations and the binding between areas in oscillatory activity, that is just purely a phenomenon of working memory, and that this is not about consciousness. It might be. I'm not saying that it is. But I had a sort of related question to you, because you mentioned that so there was this important issue of getting unity from this whole multiple areas and everything, and there was also the matter of going from parallel to serial. And now we think of some animals as being more conscious than other animals. Do you see any relationship between that and which animals may not require serial processing as much or unity as much, or these sort of things?
Yeah, that's a great question. I guess that I think that there might be some sense in which the degree of concentration into some kind of central connective core is going to be greater in a more cognitively sophisticated animal such as a human being. So it's as if there are even more resources that can be funneled into a small kind of connective core in the case of, say, in the case of a human being than a rat, say. So does that sort of answer the question? And the same, and of course, it's what passes through this sort of bottleneck that is the serial stuff. So in a way, maybe in the more cognitively sophisticated animal, you might marshal even more resources to produce what's going through that bottleneck in serial. So you get serial out of even more parallel, as it were.
I think that this issue of animals that have more consciousness capability, I think another way of looking at it is that if you have some experience, then some columns in your cortex are going to be active. And that's the information you've derived directly from the current situation. Now, the intelligence means that you can get more information than just from what you've got right there. And I think that what you could do then is picking the information, you might say, well, let's find some other columns that have often been active at the same time as the ones that are currently active. Or let's find some columns that have recently been active at the same time, or columns that changed in the past at the same time. And you can, therefore you can drive a kind of halo of extra information that you can bring to bear to determine the behavior, sort of draw on all your past. And I think one of the differences between different species may be the size of the halo that they can pull in. In other words, how much information derived from the past can be incorporated into your response in the current situation.
I'm confused by the critical branching concept, which it seemed like it was saying that the number of stimulations coming in at the bottom is pretty much maintained through the middle and up to the top. I would have guessed that the number of activations would die down so that you work from 100 down to 10 up to 1, so that you, instead of having all the information coming into your visual field, for instance, and then having 100 million pixels that I have to take care of, I've only got 1 or 2 concepts. And one of the concepts there was that, well, if you have the dial that goes all down less than 1, then it's obviously going to end up going all the way down to 0. But that's only on a very simple mathematical model. If you have a model that it goes less, but you incorporate lateral inhibition, then maybe it can go less, but at least 1. And so could you please speak to, especially, why would you want to maintain the same number of activations from layer to layer, please?
Sure. So the original idea from John Beggs and Dietmar Plenz was about maximizing information transmission across the brain. So let's start with that basic idea that if you need to get a signal from point A to point B, and if those points are sufficiently far from each other, if you are not in this state, you'll have one of 2 problems. Either you won't get there, or you'll get interference from overactivity, very loosely. And there's ways to sort of play that out mathematically. Now, so you just mentioned this idea of like, there's another intuitive sense in which you might imagine a sort of a funneling down of information from sensory input to, higher levels in the hierarchy, right? If you look, for example, at Giulio Tononi's work on integration and segregation of these sort of motifs or pathways in the brain, there is that kind of funneling, but there's also the reverse. I mean, and if you look, the brain appears to be doing both, of the funneling and expanding, and going back and forth between the two. So in that light, you might imagine that what critical branching, again, on the grand average, says that those sort of complementary forces need to be balanced out. So, yeah, go ahead.
Is the expanding only for the activation, or is expanding for perception as well?
Well, okay, so in this case, it is fairly abstract, and we're just talking about spikes, period, end of story, where the spikes are the currency with which perception and everything's sort of happening via these spikes. Yeah. Hopefully that helps. Go ahead.
So actually the expanding and the sort of funneling, when you talk about it as fan out and fan in, right, it happens even in areas where you're not talking directly about any kind of sensory input or motor output. Let's say in the hippocampal system, for example, you have some regions there where you've got a sort of a fan in, so you're really funneling things together, and then afterwards, when you get to the end of the system, it fans out again. And in that case, it's probably just because you're trying to derive information from many locations and start using them together. And then afterwards, when you've done whatever you're going to do in the hippocampus, and I'm not going to go into theories about what it is that it does, though they're really interesting, is that at the end, well, you want to put it somewhere. You're going to go and take that information and spread it out into areas where you're going to need it, or make connections with other areas where you want to make a connection with what you've just processed. So there are many reasons why you might want to do both things in different areas of the brain.
Thank you.
Hello. So my question to the speakers is regarding the level of abstraction of their models and why they think the level of abstraction that they have reached, whether it be interested in single neurons, the hippocampus, whole body movements, because they're interested in the full dynamics of embodiment, why it's the right one. Because I sort of see, I guess, a reflection of any other substrate, whether it be the logical people doing AI in the past sort of thing, and they still take into account things like whether or not it's an embodied AI perspective, or whether or not they're looking at a specific domain in that. So I don't know. I think I'm just looking for a reaction from the speakers on that point.
I'm sure. Oh, you want to go ahead. Everybody probably wants to say something.
Yeah. Okay. I think that if I can give a different example for the moment, or 2 examples. If you want to understand an electronic system, you have to think about it on the very high level of the kind of features. Then you have to think about it maybe on a more detailed level, which is the kind of major modules. Just to talk, let me talk about the hardware for a moment, just the major modules. You talk on another level about the printed circuit boards, and then you talk about another level on the integrated circuits, then you go down to transistors, and then eventually you're going into gates and so forth. And I think that the key thing is that you have to have a hierarchy of descriptions when you can, so that you can precisely map between levels. And the higher levels are a little bit approximate, but as you go down, you can get more and more precise. And nobody is able to think about every transistor in the system at the same time and follow how a feature is being performed. And that problem is universal. It's true in the sciences. You don't understand continental drift by following every electron on the quantum mechanical level. You have hierarchies of description. Now, my approach is very much to create an ordered hierarchy. And in fact, obviously there's not time to go into this in a presentation, but using the information models that I was discussing, the recommendation and the condition definition, you can actually describe high-level phenomena like episodic memory. Then you can drop down to major anatomical structures of the hippocampus and so forth. Then you can drop down to more detailed structures like cortical columns. Then you can drop down to what pyramidal neurons are doing within a column. And then you can drop down to the integration of synaptic signals within a pyramidal neuron. And then you can go down to what the various chemicals, when you access genetic information and the signals that are going to cause that. And at each level, you can actually use the same paradigms, the information processes, to describe a very slight piece at the high level, at the detailed level, but so that you can actually map all the way up. And so now, as I said, I can't cover that in a short talk, but basically, I can look at my book or the other papers, and I believe I've created a consistent hierarchy of descriptions, all the way from the psychological down to the detailed physiological.
So in your example, though, just to get into there, is it the case that one of those particular levels is more relevant to implementation, or is that you must have them all somehow in a particular physical embodiment?
Well, in implementation, I was talking about the brain in that case. Now, in terms of implementing a complex system, in reality, you probably do, most individuals, most engineers, design a system thinking about one particular level because they can be fairly confident all the other levels have been thought about by somebody else. And they can have an approximate model for what's going on at the other levels. And it can break if you try to design a system and try to do it at a high level and don't take account of what transistors are actually capable of, then your design won't work. So you have a mental model of what's going on down below, but as you go through your design, maybe you build it a bit more detailed, and then you suddenly discover, oh, my design doesn't work at that level. And so I've got to revise the higher level design in order to get in order to be able to make it compatible with the existing technology, in the cliche term.
So I certainly believe in multiple levels of abstraction, all the way up to the very high level principles to understand the nature of cognition, which is where we want to be. And clear mappings between them. But on the other hand, I do hope that there is a level below which I need not go. But I don't know yet what that level is. I hope that we don't have to worry too much about the electrochemistry of synaptic transmission, for example, and glial cells. Oh man, if they're important, we're really in trouble. Yeah. So I hope that there is a certain lower ceiling, if that's the right word, a floor, yeah.
Yeah, I'm not really sure your question is really relevant to me because I didn't present a model, right? I just argued that when you look at the mechanics of that you see in neuroscience, it's important to remember that they exist within a body and that they might be influenced with the body. As to which level of abstraction to look at, philosophically, I agree with what Murray just said. I hope that there is a lower ceiling, and I hope it's not too far low. Personally, if it's a cortical column, I'll be happy, but I don't know.
Sorry, I don't think it can be a cortical column because the avian brain is not organized into columns, so it can't be. It's got to be the case that columns don't matter.
So I'll give you just a quick pragmatic answer to that question. It's really just historical for me. We found these scaling laws that I mentioned briefly. Again, don't have too much time to go into, but they were happening at all sorts of levels, everywhere from ion channels up to group behavior and everything in between. So now the question will that at least it gives us a way to think about pervasive scaling laws, these scaling laws all over the place. Finally, how did I get to spikes? The simple answer was, I said, okay, we need a system that can get us to criticality. What's the easiest way to do that? And it just turned out that spikes were a lot easier to work with. It was a total pragmatic answer. Spikes were just really easy to come up with a mechanism that gave me criticality. And it's nothing more than that, really. So I'm not like a spike guy. I'm actually a behavioral guy, but it led me to the spikes.
Okay, well, just to add my little bit, even though I also didn't present a specific model, yeah, I agree with Murray, of course, and I agree with you as well in the sense that if I ask neuroscientists, what do you think is the level that we have to go to, most of them will say something like, well, it's probably spikes, maybe a little bit below that, but we don't have to go all the way down. And that may be true, although it depends on what you're trying to do. And just to give my perspective from what I'm known for, which is, the emulation part, whole brain emulation and this stuff, so what would you need to get down to that? Well, I had an interesting discussion with someone recently who said that, well, you obviously can't really do it because there's no way that you can get a system to behave exactly like any other system if you're using different materials. And that's true because, the material itself, like the atoms, the electrons, whatever is there, they're performing the best that they can for what they do because that's what they're for. This is the thing they do best, is their own behavior. It's just that it's a kind of a straw man because you're not really interested in all of that. It's like if you have a PC and you want to emulate it in a Mac, you're not really interested in how your PC normally warms up the environment because its circuit board is laid out in a certain way and all that kind of stuff. You're interested in, does the program run the same way on that emulator as it does on your PC? So there is a lowest level. There's a floor somewhere. We just have to figure out what it is.
So we've seen that the brain has topologically small world property, which, if I understand it properly, is that the expected path length is logarithmic in the number of nodes that you're looking at. And at some level of abstraction, they look a lot like hierarchies, which are our favorite small world networks as engineers, with these provincial hubs and connector hubs and so forth. But then when you try to find the root of the hierarchy, it seems to get a little bit confusing. And so I'm wondering if you think there might be some other class of small world networks that's disjoint from the subclass we call hierarchies that is particularly important for intelligence.
Okay, that's quite a difficult question. I mean, certainly the class of small world networks where you have high clustering coefficient and low mean path length in a sparse network is quite large and encompasses lots of networks that are not modular. I mean, for example, the classic Watt-Strogatz construction is not a modular network. And I do tend to think that there's something special about modular small world networks, especially hierarchically modular small world networks, apart from the fact that empirically that's what we find when we look at the brain. But it makes some kind of sense that the modules match up to some kind of functional specialization. And so that makes a certain sort of sense. I think that you also don't have to have hub nodes when in a modular network. So you can have a modular network with hub nodes or without hub nodes. And I think that the existence of hub nodes is quite important because that's what gives you this core, this connective core in the middle, which is where I claim everything funnels into and fans out from. So you might not have those hub nodes. So I'm not quite sure if that's not really an answer to your question in the sense that you were asking if there was something different. I'm just sort of reiterating what I think is important. So I think that collection of characteristics are the ones that are important.
I think that a related point here is that in an electronic system, we have modules. And the driving for it, well, first, a definition of a module, you tend to have a lot more information exchange within the module than between modules. And one of the main reasons we do that is because if you don't, then if you change one module, you'll have side effects spreading in an exponential fashion all over the place. Now, I think, in fact, there's a similar pressure on the brain, that if you have a network in the brain, or a module in the brain, some cluster of resources, then the more that's connected to other clusters, if the brain has to learn something, the more you're liable to get undesirable side effects propagating around. So I think there's a very strong selection pressure on the brain in favor of trying to make different pieces as isolated from each other as possible in information terms.
In terms of the brain as a pathway to AGI, at the Dartmouth Brain Engineering Lab, they're taking clusters of neurons and deriving, calling them circuits and deriving algorithms that more or less represent their function. And Rick Granger, Dr. Granger, has made some sensory-rich robots with that. He's developing prosthetic limbs. He's looking for ways to take those algorithms, create synthetic things to treat brain diseases. Can any of you comment on that? And that as a road or as a pathway to AGI, starting from the brain.
Thanks. Yeah, I think that the work that Rick Granger is doing is great, and I know that there's some very similar and interesting work also out of Steve Potter's lab and Kevin Warwick. So there are numerous people who are trying to use somewhat similar approaches to actually use biological neurons, cultured neurons that they put sometimes within specific pathways if they want to make sure they grow in a certain way, just to use them in circuitry. And there's really nothing wrong with that, but then of course the question is, why would you use one particular hardware over another if you're trying to do AGI? Hardware, well, you try to choose it for a specific purpose. Let's say you want to achieve low power, or you want to achieve a high level of parallelism, or there's some other particular reason why you're picking that hardware and using it for your solution. And maybe if you're trying to build another brain that's just like our brain, that maybe you want to use the same components, but if you're trying to drive a robot or you're trying to do something else that an AGI or an AI would do, I'd have to ask, is using a set of cultured cells really the right way to go? It depends. I mean, maybe it is. Oh, okay. Well, okay, so it's, yeah, okay. Well, okay. Well, that's, I mean, that's the approach that you take when you do computational neuroscience and you're building models based on that. And then you can drive anything with it. Yeah, sure. I mean, it's just a matter of how abstract or how detailed do you make them. So I'd still give the same answer. It's, I mean, you pick whatever lowest level implementation you think is the best for your purpose. If the thing you're trying to do is to replicate what the brain is doing as exactly as possible, say, for example, in a case of brain emulation, then I see why you would do that. But if you're trying to drive a robot or you're trying to make automated cars, then maybe it's not the right solution. It really depends on the task you're trying to do. And for AGI, artificial general intelligence, well, I think that it's, I'm trying to advocate for the idea that it's really useful to look into neuroscience to learn about some principles that we can use to do AGI. But that doesn't necessarily mean that I'm advocating that we need to do things exactly as they're done in the brain, that you would have to use the same exact circuitry to achieve something that's generally intelligent. So my feeling is that we can learn a lot from the circuitry, the way it's built in the brain, but that the more you understand, the more we're able to abstract from it, the more we're able to come up with components that are more efficient for the purposes that we're striving towards. So perhaps at some stages this is the best thing to do first. And then when you know better what you want, then you can go to something that's a little more abstract where you know, hone in on your goal a little bit more. So that'd be my answer.
Yeah, I think that I have a slightly different perspective. That I think that in fact the brain uses certain information processes. Now, computers use information processes that are things like data access and instruction execution. And that sits underneath virtually all of the information processing technology we use. And I believe the brain doesn't use those basic processes. And I also believe that those processes are the ones that are appropriate for a very, very complex learning system. You can get away with all sorts of things if you're not dealing with an extremely complex system. But as you scale up in complexity, I think those are the right information processes. Now, on the other hand, you can implement those processes on lots of different kinds of hardware. So it's not you don't have to use wetware, if you like, for your system. But I believe that you do have to find efficient ways to implement the kind of information processes that the brain uses, and then you can fit them together in a functional architecture so that you get your intelligence.
So I just thought I would ask, how do you feel the atmosphere in the field is towards building general models versus researching more specific things like maybe the behavior of a particular type of cell or particular neurotransmitter or maybe a specific area of the brain?
Well, if I try that one, I think that there is a huge amount of effort in neuroscience on very tiny amounts of tiny problems, if you like. There's a lot of effort in trying to find, for example, how genetic information is transcribed and in support of the synaptic weight changes, for example, and following thousands of different chemical paths that are involved in a weight change. And studying all the properties. If you like, it's a very intense and very narrowly focused. And I think that the problem is that in the neurosciences, generally, there's a lot of that kind of effort, and there's not a lot of communication upwards. You know, the cultural gap between even the people who do ion channels and chemistry up to the people who study certain anatomical structures is very large. And there's a huge gap then from those people up into the psychologists, that sort of, you know, lots of people do fMRI imaging, but on the other hand, the imaging can't get down to looking at individual neurons. So I think that there's huge camps that have very little to do with each other in the neurosciences.
So part of that, actually, there's a reason for that, of course. There's a reason why a lot of people spend their entire career looking at just like one of those processes, like one of these, okay. Yeah, exactly. It's tenure. It's how do you manage to produce a lot of papers very quickly and get grants? Well, one of the things that you do is you concentrate on something really small that you can keep on producing data on and keep on saying something that's just a tiny little bit more or different than what you said just before. And, you know, that's the way the system works. So that's one of the reasons why I was trying to point out that what we also need is we need, you know, people to take entrepreneurial approaches, for example, or anything where it's absolutely necessary that you become more interdisciplinary, that you at least look at different levels within the system, and that you go beyond that. So, yeah, part of it's just the nature of the system.
So just a short comment on this. I concur with what everybody's been saying. I think that neuroscience seriously lacks a large theory of brain function, and people are very reluctant to work on that kind of thing for just the kinds of reasons that Randal just set out, I think. So maybe maybe Randal needs to go to the neuroscience community and get them to be interested in the NGI problem, the natural general intelligence problem.
That was a great remark. Now, you just had this opposition between brain and computer. The computer does it this way, the brain does it that way. And to some extent, this might come down to the question whether the brain is a computer or the world is a computer. So we really need a body because the world is something entirely different and so on. And as a computer, I think we see it as something that manages regularity in information. It's some very, very general notion, according to the Church-Turing thesis. And traditional AI has worked on the premise that basically everything is a computer, like physics does, even still these days. It's a notion that is not completely shared in all of philosophy of mind, but it's something that has been a central tenet of artificial intelligence and the mind as machine kind of cognitive science. And if you are saying, for instance, that we really need a body, how do you mean that? Would you accept a virtual body too, like in a computer game? And if you would accept that we have a virtual body in a computer game, we could take this computer game, burn it onto a microchip, and implant it in the brain. So it's completely internal to the mind in some way. If we just have a prosthesis, which is an integral part of the mind, and something which lends a little bit more organization to our mental stage, so we can meditate about this game, so to speak. Would you be satisfied with that, or would you argue that no, we need physical embodiment because physics gives you some touch of a mystical reality substance that somehow enables us to be intelligent?
Okay, I didn't really say that you absolutely definitely need a physical body, but what I did say is that when you look at the human mind and human cognition, we do have a physical body and we do exist in a physical world, not in a simulated world, and that does affect the way we.
I spend more time in the virtual world than in the physical world.
Okay.
It's only incidental that I still have this body.
Okay, but in the general case, I do think that yeah. Embodiment affects cognition, right? Your body determines. Sorry? Well, that's up to you, right? Certainly, I guess you can make the point that if you're building an artificial general intelligence machine, yeah, that might well be possible without being in a physical world. It's just that we humans are in a physical world. We probably want to interact with these artificially intelligent machines. So I don't know, if you have an artificially intelligent machine that exists completely outside the physical world, I'm not sure we would even perceive it as intelligent in a true sense, or that we could really interact with it in a complete sense. So I think it will need a physical instance, at least to be able to interact with humans in a nice, intelligent, social way. You're not going to agree with that, are you?
I have had interesting, intelligent conversations over the internet, yes, without being physically interacting with people. I do believe that this is fundamentally possible. You don't? Sure, I am a human, I'm a primate basically, and my primate mind has been evolved to control the movement of my body. I completely agree with that. But I'm not talking about this, I'm talking about artificial general intelligence. So I want to know an argument, a philosophical argument, not a practical evolutionary one, because this only applies to me. I want to have one which helps me to structure my work. I want to know if I need to build robots, or if I can have a chance to build something that works over the internet.
It would be great if the speakers there, if you guys had microphones, because it's very hard for people here to hear what you're saying. If you could just come up to the line, maybe, I mean, it would help. We have a couple of minutes left, so if you guys finish the conversation and then we have one more question, then that's probably the end of the panel.
Depending, I was going to jump in.
Okay, so basically, I feel like we converged on there's two different ways to. So, do you need a body for intelligence? And his answer, I think, is no, because someone could set you up in a little room with an energy box and lots of energy, and then you could develop an AGI without a body and survive until your energy ran out.
That's the AGI, yes, indeed.
Okay, and so we go back to his question in that case, which is, in this little room, is it possible to become intelligent given that you have lots of energy and no body? Yeah.
And so there's two answers to that. If you want to build a real human, then indeed it's very useful to build an embodied system. But as long as you're just going for a general intelligence, that's not. It's useful, but it's not necessary.
I'll take a different crack at that, just because it's something I've been wanting to sort of mention in this group, and now's a good time to mention it. So, embodiment and environment grounds us, right? It's sort of the ground truth. It's what basically allows us to coordinate and communicate amongst each other. So I'm going to sort of throw something out there that I don't think this community is maybe particularly interested in, which is that, part of what makes us intelligent is that we're social creatures, right? It's not, if you look at all of our sort of accomplishments, our greatest accomplishments are as societies and cultures, and so what makes us smart is our ability to connect with each other, right? And I think embodiment is absolutely essential. Now, you can be embodied in different ways. It doesn't have to be this particular body, but you need a grounding. You need a common ground so that you can have that kind of coordination that makes individual brains smart, in my opinion.
What happens if you only have signals going back and forth?
Right. Well, again, it's sort of like it's the meaning problem,
Mona Lisa
right?
overdraft kind of thing.
It's the meaning problem. It's like, what does that signal refer to? Right? This is a classic sort of philosophical. I'm not saying I have the answer to the problem, but it's yeah.
I watch TV.
But how do I know that my signals connect with your signals without that embodiment and environment, without that grounding? How do I know how to map them? See what I'm saying?
You'd have to program it properly, but
okay.
You'd have to have. It's got to watch lots of YouTube.
But I think the bottom line is, in order to program it properly, you'll need a grounding, and I think that's what embodiment gives you. That's 2 cents.
I don't really want to have.
So
I have an easier question.
Necessary, but not necessary.
The last question, please. I have an easier question. Does this reservoir computing idea naturally do Occam's razor? And if not, can you make it do that?
So find the simplest solution to some given function? Is that what you're saying?
The simpler ideas, yeah.
I don't know. I think that's a hard question. I would have to really. How would I? I'm just trying to think. How would I test that? How would I sort of make that a concrete?